and welcome back to session 2 of HTML5. In today's session, we'll be talking about HTML5 web workers, which is part of the performance and integration part of HTML5. So let's quickly recap what we have discussed in part 1 of HTML5. We have talked about the semantics, which provide meaningful value to your HTML page. We have talked about the new input types, and we have seen what types of validations are supported. Only a few of them that we could see in the example that we did. But again, the point is, if you are using AngularJS or some other JavaScript MVC framework, you would want to turn off the browser validations that come with HTML5. Okay, so without wasting much time, let's delve into web workers. Alright, so what is a web worker? It is a spider web drawn across different worker images. My bad, that was just a joke. In all seriousness, a web worker is a JavaScript running in the background without affecting the performance of the page. Only thing is, the JavaScript that is running in the background should be independent and should be able to run on its own. That means it doesn't need to be referencing any page elements or something like that. Why exactly? We'll see in our next slides. So as we have known, as web transitions from server heavy implementations to the client side JavaScript, the challenge that has remained was JavaScript runtime. And what exactly is the problem? JavaScript runtimes supports execution only on a single thread. Yes, there is XML HTTP request, but again, it can only load resources from remote servers and get the appropriate data using an asynchronous call. But again, for those asynchronous events to be executed, they can only be executed after the current UI thread is freed. Okay, so that is a very important aspect, not to confuse between XML HTTP request and web workers. Okay, let's move on. So let's see the communication between web worker and the main UI thread. So in this case, your main UI thread starts executing, and as required, it will instantiate a web worker JavaScript file. And then after a certain point, if you are looking at the left hand side of it, we'll talk about the two-way communication. There is two-way communication and there is one-way communication. So what is two-way communication? So whenever the web page wants to talk to its worker and the worker also wants to talk to its web page, then that's a two-way communication. So all communications to and from the worker thread is managed through something called messages. Okay, so in this case, on the left hand side, focus on the left hand side. Let me get a pointer real quick. Focus on the left hand side. So we instantiate a web worker, which we named as web worker 1, and it loads a JavaScript file, like I said, which should be independent. And in the second part of it, the main page code calls something called calls post message, which is a JavaScript function to send a message to the worker. So messages is what gets transported, and how that message is posted is done via post message, which is a JavaScript function available for HTML5. Okay, then main page code calls something called a post message method in JavaScript, which sends a message to the worker, and then the worker 1 listens for on message event from the page and then reads that message. Then let's talk about how a worker 1 wants to send back its message to the main thread. So after processing, workers can call post message with the event, just how the main page was able to call a post message. Worker also can send can also call the post message and send the appropriate data in the event.data. So event.data is a property that you would want to look for when wanting to read the data from the message. So in this case, the worker 1 is sending back message to the web page. In one-way communication, so you only need to worry about half of it. So where a web worker is instantiated, and once the web worker finishes its execution, it calls a post message with the data in the event.data, and the web page listens to an on message event via a listener in the web page. Okay, we'll see an example of how a two-way communication is performed, which pretty much covers one-way communication. So you need to decide, that's a design choice, right? When you want one-way communication or whether you want two-way communication. What is an appropriate scenario? Anyone who has worked with long long running JavaScript functions or a lot of UI processing in JavaScript, then they probably have seen this pages or page being unresponsive. This is a typical Chrome web page which is loading a lot of JavaScript or doing a lot of background functions, and there were some interactions on the web page which made the page unresponsive because the UI thread is busy doing some background calculations, and there were some click events on the page, or we tried to drag and drop or do something funky with the page, in which case the web page UI thread is not free. To solve the same problem, we have something called web workers. Okay, so what are some factors that we need to consider? So the code that needs to be executed will have to be in its own separate JavaScript file. Okay, the next thing is, what is the browser support? What kind of browser support do I have? Do I have Chrome? So if it's Chrome, it's 4.0, IE 10.0, Mozilla, Safari, so forth. Before using any feature of HTML5, you should always check for browser support. How do I do browser support check? If you have followed my previous example, I was using Modernizer. I'll show that example again. Even if you did not look at the first session, we'll look at that, how to use Modernizer to verify if a feature is available or not. And that's how I would check browser support. And most important thing is, always terminate your web workers after the external script you are executing is finished. So when a web worker object is created, it will continue to listen for messages. So even after the external script is finished, it's uh, it's going to still keep on listening to the events. So you should always terminate web workers and free some resources for the browser, and most importantly the computer resources. You don't want your web page using up all the threads of your client machine. So for that, you would want to ideally terminate and use it, put it to better use, unless you are trying to hack somebody's web pages or something like that. That's a completely different picture. So web workers do not have access to anything related to the view of the web page. That is very important to know. So all the window dot get element by id, document dot get element by id, any window functions or elements of the view or attributes, you don't have access to them. Okay, so it's strictly an independent block of code running that can process some calculations or do some processing on a given object and send back the processed response to the web page. Okay, so they have something called a mini DOM that helps maintain separate state, but it has nothing to do with the main DOM of the page itself. So any element that you see on the web page, you don't have access to it. So if you're using a jQuery or something, then you'd probably not want to use element dot or whatever that is. Okay, so make sure you don't use anything in the web page. So another important aspect that I would recommend, there is, whenever we are talking about multiple threads being used, then in those scenarios you would ideally want to have those initial, there'll always be an overhead in creating and spawning a spawning a web worker and getting the process results from it, and there is this time that is required for communication. So those are the factors that you need to consider. So if the processing power that you're gaining out of using web worker is less than the initialization time and the communication time itself, then web worker is probably not a good candidate to use. With all the theory out of the way, Let's take a look at a live example of how to use web workers in the code. Exciting? All right, let's get started. Okay, in today's example, we will look at how to do the genotype evaluation. Okay, maybe too boring. So let's look at another simple example. Sorry, I've been playing too many pranks in this session. I'll try to, I promise that was the last prank that I had. So you remember in the first session, we built this page using HTML semantics, HTML5 semantics. And so let's say this is what we want to build. We had a quiz and we want to add a timer. And this timer could be something very complicated that we want to calculate and send it back. So if you see this, then it's changing seconds. So we want to simulate this scenario using web workers. Okay. So let's take the look at the code, and it's pretty simple. I'll show you how easy it is to implement web workers. As I said, there is the start worker and stop worker. So whenever you're done with a worker, then ideally you would have to close it out by calling a terminate method. So this is the same code. So all I did was, in this first section where the quiz was, or the second section where the quiz was, I just added a timer and set out an output element that shows how much time do I have that is remaining. Okay. So let's take a look. I create a start worker, and all I did was I downloaded the modernizer JavaScript file and placed it in my project. So if you want to look at my files, it's pretty simple. If you don't have Visual Studio, nothing to panic. Even a notepad would just be fine. So let me show you the files real quick. So all I did was download this modernizer from Google. Just search for modernizer and it'll point to your website, and just download the modernizer, whatever latest version that is. Just download it, paste it in your folder. Okay. So here is my HTML page. Here is my bootstrap theme that I picked from the HTML5 part 1 session. Even if you don't have it, nothing to worry. Just keep your focus on how to wrap up this web workers part of it. Okay. I declared a variable called timer web worker, and as you can see, there is this modernizer object that we have access. So once I have access to my modernizer, then I'm going to check if my browser is going to support web workers or not. So the way I'm going to do it is in my start worker method. Like I said, I had start worker, I have stop worker methods which are empty right now, which we are going to fill it with how do we communicate with web workers. So I'm going to check if my browser is going to support web workers using this very specific statement, modernizer.webworkers. If it is true, then go ahead and instantiate your timer web worker. If type of timer web worker is equal to undefined, then I'm going to instantiate a new instance of my quiz timer, the chicken quiz. Okay. And then I'm going to send a message to my timer web worker and send it some parameters that says okay. Okay, and this is how I'm going to send a message, the post message method. So in the two-way communication part of it, this is how I communicate from my web page to the timer web worker. We'll take a look at the code in quiztimer.js in a quick second here, but when I say timer dot post message, it's going to send a message to the worker, and the message will be here is a chicken quiz and it has a 50-second time limit. Okay, Then I need to listen for any events that are coming from my web workers. So for that, I'm just going to add a listener for a message event, for an on message event, and say once I get, let me show you this. And then when I get a message in the event.data, you remember in the two-way communication or one-way communication, event.data is where the real data resides. Like messages that are transmitted will have a data property in the event that is coming in, and that is the data that is being transferred across. So in this case, what I'm going to do is document.getElement by id of time remaining. You remember the output element that I showed you at the very top, right here, right next to the chicken quiz question. I'm just going to set an output value, and I'm going to set the value of whatever data that is coming from the web worker to it. And if the data is eventually 0 seconds remaining, then I'm going to say stop worker. So let's see what comprises stop worker. So in this case, I'm just going to say terminate on okay, and then I'm going to set timer web worker is equal to null, and then we are pretty good. So this is the code that is required to instantiate communication and call a web worker from your web page. So first check for the browser support, then check if your worker has already been instantiated and in process. If not, then try to send a message to your worker with the right command and parameters. So if you look at the code for worker message, I have a custom function here which says okay, set the command and parameter, and then when I'm listening for an event, then I'm going to say add event listener from my web page from your worker, and I'm just going to do whatever I want to do with my event.data, and I'm eventually going to say stop worker when I think this worker has completed enough work for me. Okay, again, the other other important factor that I was mentioning previously was the time to instantiate, and the time for communication that happens should be less, not typically, should be less than the processing power itself. In this case, I may not have gained much, but to keep it simple, to show you the concept of web worker, then I have done that. Okay, so let's take a look at the JavaScript class that we have. The first thing that I need to do with my JavaScript is listen for any events from my page. So if you looked at the quiztimer.js, I'm just going to listen for this dot add event listener and listen for any message that is coming from my web page. And when I say time count, call a function called time count. Let's go and take a look at the time count function. Again, as usual, the data comes from event.data, and my event.data contains a command and a parameter value that I set from my web page. Then I'm going to check if it's a chicken quiz question, then send this kind of message, whatever seconds remaining from message from of whatever is the time limit, and then I'm going to say post message. So when I say post message from my worker, it's going to send a message back to the main page. Okay, so when I say web worker.post message, it's going to send a message from the web page to the worker. In this case, when I say from the quiztimer.js, when I say this dot post message, it's going to send a message to the main web page UI thread. Okay, and then I'm using set timeout function, which is again an HTML5 function, HTML function that's going to make a recursive call to the time count function here and say 500 millisecond time limit. Every 500 milliseconds, just go ahead and call this time count function. Okay, it's like a recursive, like it's a common feature, right? So whenever you are tasked with reading from a directory or subdirectory, then you keep on recursing until you hit the final subdirectory. So it's very similar. So I use that concept in a very similar way using this set timeout function. So every 500 milliseconds, this timed event count keeps getting recursively called. And like another important aspect, you should always close the timer workers, because once it starts listening, is instantiated and starts listening for the messages, it's going until you kill the web worker, it's going to keep on listening. Okay. And for more sophisticated examples, there is this website that I wanted to show you guys. It's called Mandelbro. So it's a pretty interesting website. Here, show you that, and then we should be wrapped up with our session today. Mandelbrot. So it's a pretty sophisticated mathematical objects that you use to generate these images. So how do you explore Mandelbrot set? He has shown a very good example here of how to use web workers in a sophisticated way. If the web workers have to communicate among themselves, like between web workers, there is something called message channels. Again, that would be out of the scope of this session. But again, like I said, if you want to go ahead and look at more advanced concepts, that is where you start. Maybe we can take a look at some other advanced session, and that'll be good. Then here he is showing you how to leverage web workers. Here is the URL. Okay. And he has shown you how to use your web workers and how is he listening back on various messages. It's a pretty interesting thing. Just go take a look at it and take a step. Okay. Hope I have given you enough information that is helpful for your preparation for HTML5, and see you next time.